because if something's not done, democracy will be stolen in South Africa. This is frightening, very frightening prospect. And this is not hyperbole. I'm not embellishing. I'm not being over the top for viewer ratings. This isn't even my channel, or my program. I'm being honest here. This is a very frightening situation to see the ANC try to circumvent the Constitution because they're wildly unpopular because of their own actions.
Hello, my name is Donald. I'm filling in for Petrus, who's currently looting a shop in KwaZulu-Natal. This is WorldView, and at WorldView we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've liked our content so far and enjoyed it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Colonel Chris Wyatt. Colonel Chris Wyatt has served 36 years in the US Army, 34 on active duty, and 23 of those years overseas. He was stationed in Europe for 4 tours, 3 in Germany and 1 in Italy. In Africa, Colonel Wyatt served in Tunisia, Liberia, Botswana, Malawi, Niger, Mauritania, Uganda, and Ethiopia. He is a published author, an academic and popular press on a variety of topics including defense, security, international politics, and rugby. A combat veteran, Chris has also participated in peacekeeping and development programs. He speaks 6 languages, 3 of them African, and is a strong advocate on African affairs. Since retiring from the army, Chris has established his own consultancy, the Indaba Africa Group, developed a following on social media, and resumed his role as a radio personality. Colonel, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks a lot, Donald. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
So, Colonel, I've read quite a long intro, but can you expand a bit on that? How did you end up in the United States, and what was your army career like?
Well, I wound up in the United States because that's where I was born. So I'm an American by birth, and my Army career was pretty amazing. It spanned nearly 5 decades. People look at, how could it be 5 decades? You're not that old. Even with the gray ZZ Top beard, I'm not as old as I look younger than I am. But no, nearly 5 decades. I served during the Cold War as an enlisted soldier in active duty in Europe during the General Defense Plan against the Soviets, the Warsaw Pact, and then I went back to university where I had been before I went in the Army, and I was in the National Guard, so reserve component for a couple of years, then commissioned as an intelligence officer, came back in active duty, and then spent 30 years. So all total, 36 and a half years in the Army, 34 years on active service. I served, 4 tours in Europe, 3 in Germany, 1 in Italy as a private, a sergeant, a lieutenant, a captain, and as a lieutenant colonel. And then in Italy, I was a captain, and also in the Balkans and things like that. In Africa, my tours include duty in Tunisia, Liberia, Botswana, Malawi, Niger, Mauritania, Uganda, and Ethiopia at the African Union. I've worked a lot of projects in Africa, rebuilding armies like in Liberia, designing intelligence infrastructure for Botswana, schools, clinics, HIV programs, Ebola research, tuberculosis programs, counterterrorism operations, peacekeeping. I'm a published author in academic circles and in popular press where I write as a rugby journalist. But my career in the Army was pretty amazing. I worked at the Pentagon, the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency. I worked with some of the biggest names that you've probably heard on 4 of those people, and was very fortunate to be involved in some very consequential activities over the past 5 decades. I only left the Army because that's the law. I can't stay past 30 years as a colonel. Otherwise, I'd still be on active duty. I wouldn't have this beard. I would have this short haircut, though. And I'd be working out more religiously than I am right now. I still work out, but not quite as religiously as I used to. I only left because I had to. There's you age out at some point, and that was my point. Otherwise, I would have stayed. I would tell you this, though, that I'm very disheartened by events in the U.S. of late, and I'm not so sure that given the current circumstances, if I was on active duty, if I wouldn't retire instantly because I'm so dismayed. But anyway, it was a brilliant career from my perspective. I really enjoyed it all over the world.
Well, it's fascinating, but I think what threw me off is the fact that you're so obviously in love with rugby. You have the Springbok jersey. What got you into rugby? Why are you such a US born but so a fan of rugby?
Well, at university in okay, turn your speakers down now. 1982. Okay, now you can turn them back up. At university as a freshman, 1982, one of the upperclassmen came to me after a military science lab on a Friday, and he said, "Hey, you coming to the game tonight?" And I'm like, "Game's tomorrow." He goes, "No, not football, rugby." I'm like, I'm from Appalachia. We're just happy to have paved roads and electricity. True story, by the way. So didn't have electricity for a while there growing up in high school, but or flush toilets or anything like that. So he said, "Come to the game. You'll have a great time." So I went to the game. It was played on the practice fields where the band goes out and then the football team practices in the summertime. So there's no stands. You stand and touch, and it's painted on the field. And I'm like, okay, it's not Australian rules football. It's not American football. Thank God it's not soccer. I don't know what it is, but I love it. This is cool. And I don't even remember who won, but the two clubs were playing, and one side got slaughtered when the game was over. Everybody had a beer and well, they didn't call it a braai, but basically a braai, and they hung out, and everything was cool. And I'm like, this is a really neat game. And so I became a fan then, but of course there was no professional rugby back then anywhere in the world. It wasn't until a decade later we got professional rugby. So you couldn't really watch it on television because the US wouldn't be playing, All Blacks or England games. That's just not something they did. So it was tough to be a fan, but as a historian, I followed the game. I did research on it, and I decided that I was going to support a national team. And lo and behold, I found out that the US didn't have a national team. We didn't have a national side. We were the reigning Olympic rugby champions from 1920 and 24 and 15s, and we're the only Olympic champions because it was canceled after 24 until Rio. And but we didn't have a national team. A bunch of college kids were sent over as amateurs for that, so we never had a national team. So the American USA Rugby didn't come around until after I became a rugby fan. So I looked at the history. I had interest in Africa, and I saw that South Africa and the All Blacks and England and Ireland and Scotland were among the top teams historically. And I said, you know what? I'm going to become a Springboks fan. And I became a Springboks fan. And the first question I got was, what are you, a racist? I'm like, huh? What do you mean a racist? Well, because you're supporting rugby. I'm like, it's a game. Yeah, but it's racist. No, the game's not racist. What is in South Africa? Okay, it's a game. Take a breath, okay? So I became a Springboks fan. I've been one ever since. So there you go.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I've watched, this is really how I found you. I watched a very interesting video where he gave an assessment to Americans on the current situation of South Africa. What can you give us a summary of that? And because I found it fascinating, because obviously a lot of Americans are not so clued up about South Africa and the political situation. What do you tell Americans about South Africa?
Well, honestly, to be fair, a lot of South Africans aren't so clued up on South Africa. But just like a lot of Americans aren't clued up on America. But what I tell Americans about South Africa, it's an absolutely amazing place. It's a fantastic country with an unbelievable history, good and bad, but fascinating history nonetheless. Also, I talk to Americans about the parallels between South Africa and America. Whether it's if you want to look at the Bantu migrations down the Rift Valley into what became South Africa after they crossed the Limpopo River, or you want to talk about European arrival in the Western Cape and then the movement as they went eastward instead of westwards. We went westwards, they went eastwards, and then they went north. They are very, very similar things. Americans, by and large, despite the political outcomes, tend to be conservative and people of faith, by and large. And it's the same thing in South Africa, regardless of religious group. They tend to be people of faith and conservative. We, for the most part, have great faith in our God and our guns, much to the chagrin of Barack Obama. And South Africans, it's the same. And a lot of people think it's just white South Africans that are like that. It's not. It's South Africans, generally speaking, are like that. And so there's a lot of parallels. We've always had this unbridled enthusiasm, this constant drive to continue growing and expanding our country. Went from one coast to the other coast. It was a concept called manifest destiny in the 19th century that was coined for this. But South Africans are very similar, whether it's Bantus coming south or it's Europeans coming and then meeting up with the Khoisan and fighting 9 wars, and then moving north. It's many very similarities. So, but what I tell people beyond that about South Africa around the world is that, wow, things are not good right now. I was very generous to South Africa and to the ANC in particular up through early 2018. And I said that after a decade of nonsense, there's a chance for this country to get it right. But I didn't fall for Ramaphoria. I thought that was nonsense. I said, but if Cyril Ramaphosa wants to change things, he has to be serious about it. He has a very narrow window, very narrow window. And instead of addressing real change or substantive change in South Africa, he reinforced the patent failures that were taking place. And not only reinforced the failures, but we lived a decade under Zuma state capture. I would argue that under Ramaphosa, not only is state capture not gone away, it's as bad or worse than it ever was. It's just taking different forms. And so I tell people that South Africa is on the verge of being a collapsed state. And the recent looting and riots in KZN and Gauteng kind of reinforced my argument there. I'm not arguing the society is going to collapse, but frankly, if the ANC, if they actually cared about South Africa, they would resign. They would suspend parliament. They would resign. They would form a caretaker government composed of all parties that are in parliament, and that would go until the next elections. Because these people are just they're racketeers. They're gangsters. I mean, the mob has nothing on the ANC. I mean, the ANC has learned how to steal money from everything. They, with a straight face, can pass legislation that they say is to fight racism, which is racist.
Yeah, we've spoken to economist Davie Rood, he's quite popular in South Africa, who said that the ANC is essentially a criminal organization masquerading as government. I mean, you can't put it any other way.
Well, that's how I call them a RICO operation, which is a racketeering and statute we have in the States. The ANC is a RICO organization. It's a corrupt criminal organization masquerading as a government. And the EFF is a domestic terrorist organization masquerading as a political party.
Yeah, definitely. Now, they would say, and you're an intelligence expert, so it would be very interesting to hear your opinion, but they would say, okay, but some of the blowback that we have suffered, that we can't really pursue our agenda, is because of CIA operatives. They sometimes use this word. I mean, is there any credibility to this argument? Is there any way that the CIA really cares about South Africa and is trying to influence its politics?
Well, having worked in the intelligence community, there's obviously certain things I can't talk about. But what I can tell you this is that South Africa occupies virtually no time in the intelligence community at any agency, and virtually no time in the decision-making circles of the U.S. policy establishment. I've written for the President of the United States. I can tell you that getting the president or getting the cabinet or getting any of the intelligence agencies' interest on South Africa is almost impossible. A lot of Americans, particularly on the political left in this country, live with a vision of South Africa from the 27th of April, 1994, which was dated by 1995 and certainly dated by 2000, and is a distant, in geologic terms, 40 million year view of South Africa in 2021. It's no, the CIA in South Africa, if you're asking if CIA operates in South Africa, the CIA operates all over the world, and that's probably all I can say about that. But no, it's the same thing as the secret American air base in Botswana. Please, Tebe Patswe is not a secret air base. It's there. The public goes there. The press goes there. I've been there a few hundred times when I was stationed in Botswana. It is not an American base. There are no American troops there. There are no American aircraft there. Walk through, look, you won't find a damn thing because it doesn't exist. But we saw Americans there. Yeah, we had a mill-to-mill exchange. We scheduled it 8 months ago. The people came over from the North Carolina National Guard. They worked with the C-130s here. And guess what? 2 of the C-130s that Botswana has were actually in the Air Guard in North Carolina. So what a really good happenstance, serendipitous circumstance. Anyway, it's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. And if people want to believe it, fine. Believe what you want. But some people you can't reason with. The CIA, frankly, I mean, here's the thing. I hate to hurt South Africans' feelings, but South Africa doesn't matter.
Yeah,
and now it doesn't even matter on the world stage anymore. It's not even a good example of a rainbow nation, of a transition from what it was to an independent state. That model's gone. The ANC has destroyed South Africa, and the world doesn't care. The world doesn't care. I'm sorry. I love South Africa and Africa in general, but that's just the reality. Honestly, I mean, people thought when Donald Trump did a tweet about farm murders in South Africa, he was going to do something. I'm like, no, I voted for Trump twice. I'm not a fan, but I voted for him twice. But he's not going to do anything for South Africa. It's not in our interest. It's not in our interest. The total volume of trade between South Africa and the U.S. is less than $20 billion per year. Quite frankly, because the ANC has tabled a constitutional amendment to steal your property without compensation, with no justification whatsoever, which will be used as a political tool to cow the political opposition. That's what I've been arguing. It's not about land. Yes, they'll use it to take land, but it's about silencing opponents. So you want to keep lipping off in public in the newspaper about our party and about what we're doing? That pension fund and that Mercedes in your front yard are going to disappear. We'll take your house, and then you're quiet. But no, it's anyway. So yeah, I'm getting off track there, but
no, yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that property is both immovable and movable. So that means also cars, like you precisely mentioned.
Jewelry.
And I don't think, jewelry. And I think definitely most South Africans would agree with you. I mean, South Africa doesn't matter in the world stage, and they don't at all consider it legitimate that the CIA is the reason we're in this mess. I mean, really.
No, the reason that South Africa's in this mess, it's You can blame some things on the apartheid system, no doubt about it. But the biggest thing I blame on apartheid is the National Party's socialist approach. What? What? Yes, they were socialist. The National Party, in many ways, is very much what the ANC has become in post 94. So they love patronage networks, but let's be honest, most of the people who benefited from patronage networks were Afrikaans, white South Africans, by and large, under the National Party. Jobs were created for people based on their ethnicity and their appearance and their language, and benefits were accrued to them. The system was set up to not just them, but that's the folks who were mostly benefited. That doesn't mean all Afrikaners profited, but I'm saying that was the select. The ANC has its own selection of cadre, which includes some whites and some colored, some Indians, but mostly black Africans. And anyway, so they also had a fondness for parastatals. Now, some would argue they had no choice. They had to come up with Sassel. They had to come up with Denel because of sanctions and because of all these other things. Yeah, but those state parastatals were created long before sanctions ever came in South Africa. The state controlled the economy. The state controlled, and they had a security state. I mean, the parliament was rump by the late 1970s. After Soweto in 76, the parliament was just a rubber stamp, especially after 84 when they remade it with Indian and colored parts of it. It just did what the security state under the chief executive, the intelligence services, and the military told them to, and the police told them to do. So in many ways, they're very much the same, the ANC. But back to the point I was getting at, and I got off track there. The ANC, the reason South Africa is broken is because the ANC. You can blame a little bit on apartheid, but the bottom line is that this is all at the ANC's feet. 27 years. Why does South Africa have to spend 7.1 billion US dollars to buy Hawk lead-in fighter trainers, Gripen jets, because the Chinese fighters that we prevented from being shipped to Namibia were going to invade your airspace? The Zimbabweans who can't put their planes in the air because they have no petrol, they're going to invade your airspace? Is Eswatini a threat? Is the king coming? He's had enough of the Reed dance. He's going to invade South Africa now. Why do you need submarines? 3 Type 209, 3 cruisers that aren't even put to sea? It's ridiculous. They need it because they were prestige products, just like South African Airways. It's all about ego with these clowns. And it was a way to steal money, to be rich. And that's what it's all about. So the $7.1 billion wasted on that could have been spent on primary education to fix schools. Instead, the schools are worse today than they were under apartheid. Now, don't get me wrong. South Africa's always had world-class schools. I mean, if you went to an elite private school, you had the best education in the world, better than like Eton in the UK and places like that. But public schools weren't. Public schools for minority population were pretty good, but for other folks they weren't so good. That doesn't mean they were all bad. But now they're all terrible. They're all, instead of reinforcing success or building off the failure, they've destroyed everything. They fired Afrikaans and English-speaking white teachers because, that's just wrong. We need transformation. Yeah, you transformed into a crap hole. You've destroyed education. Children dying in pit latrines because they choked to death on feces falling in primary school. It didn't happen once. It's happened at least twice that we know of. This is a disgrace. This is the ANC. They have wasted so much money. The National Strategic Oil Reserve, they sold it off in a corrupt deal. All these corrupt tenders to non-existent companies because the owners are black. It's ridiculous. It goes on. In Conla, you've got Travelgate. You've got one scandal. I can't even keep track of all the scandals. All the billions of dollars that have been stolen and looted from South Africans instead of put into infrastructure, instead of put in education. And then what do we get? Well, it's all the fight of white monopoly. It's the fault of white monopoly capital. It's the fault of white racist. No, it's not. Stop it. The reason that South Africans are poor, the reason that black South Africans by and large live worse today than they did in 1994 is all attributable to the African National Congress and nobody else.
No, definitely. And I wish more South Africans were as passionate as you were on this subject and also clued up on the facts. But now this is all probably led to the looting you've seen recently, the violent protests. How has this been perceived worldwide, and what do you think is going to lead from this? Is there going to be more protests? Is it going to sweep the ANC out of power? How do you think this is all going to end?
It's not going to sweep the ANC out of power. First off, they're desperately trying to violate the Constitution by having the 27 October municipal elections delayed. Just earlier today, we saw Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the Minister of Uncooperative Governance and Irrational Affairs. She came out earlier wearing sunglasses like some hungover harlot, standing up there telling us that they're going forward with the day, the 27 October, but they're hoping, because they can't legally stop it. The government can't. The Independent Electoral Commission is responsible for conducting these elections. And so the only hope that the ANC has is that the Independent Electoral Commission will take the recommendations of former Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke that it's not safe to hold free and fair elections in South Africa because of the pandemic. Woo! hide your children. It's not safe. I mean, the Central African Republic can hold an election. Somaliland can hold an election. Only 6 countries in the world recognize Somaliland. Central African Republic is a failed country. Zambia is holding elections on August 12th. And they just deployed the army because 2 people were killed in pre-election violence. But it's safe for them to hold elections. 30 African countries, 35 elections during the pandemic. But South Africa, the most advanced economy, the best infrastructure, the best transport system, can't hold elections. No, it's not safe for the ANC because they'll get their hat handed to them. So they're doing desperately, they're trying to get this delayed to February, which violates the Constitution in my view. And I'm not a constitutional expert, but I have read South Africa's rather long and liberal constitution. And I'm astounded that that more people aren't up in arms. I mean, when Moseneke came out and had the press conference, I went on, I covered that live, and then I went on and I said, South Africans, you just got to stop being apathetic. You must deluge your members of parliament. I know they don't respond to you because you don't pick them. The parties pick them. But deluge their emails, deluge their phone lines. Call every ward councillor. Call every MEC in your parliament, in your provinces.
I think the problem is you can't reach them. The cell phone lines and the emails don't work.
Well, I mean, one of the solutions for ending the looting is apparently, the ban on gatherings was lifted during the looting because that was going to end it. So now that there's no ban on gatherings, just go gather at their homes, go gather at their offices, get caught on the radio, get caught in press, make them hear you, because if something's not done, democracy will be stolen in South Africa. This is frightening, very frightening prospect. And this is not hyperbole. I'm not embellishing. I'm not being over the top for viewer ratings. This isn't even my channel, or my program. I'm being honest here. This is a very frightening situation to see the ANC try to circumvent the Constitution because they're wildly unpopular because of their own actions. And that's what, but the thing is that municipal elections, they know the deal. And in municipal elections, it's not just in South Africa, but pretty much consistent around the world. 31 to 38% of the eligible voters show up. That's very low. So a small party with a handful of votes can unseat the major party in a municipality. And that's what they're afraid of. I'll tell you right now, I had predicted before the looting in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng that the DA would retain Western Cape Town. They would win Nelson Mandela Bay outright, which they failed to do last time they go into coalition. They would win Shwana or Pretoria outright, and they could win Johannesburg, but the joker in that is that Herman Mashaba left the party, formed his own party, so he still remains popular. And if he runs as an independent, he might siphon off a third to half the vote. So they might have to go into coalition Joburg. But I didn't predict that they would win Durban. Right now, I'm predicting if there was a vote today, the ANC would be out, and either the IFP and the DA coalition or the DA would win Durban today. I tell you that. People think you're crazy. I'm not crazy. I pay attention to what's going on, and I know a lot about elections.
Well, I've spoken to a political analyst yesterday, and he said precisely the same thing, that Durban is really on the cards now, and that, for example, the ANC they shrunk 10% in the previous election in KwaZulu-Natal. So absolutely, Durban is definitely on the cards that it can fall below 50%, and then it can go to a coalition government, which would be a devastating loss to the ANC. It's one of their heartlands, Durban.
Oh, absolutely. It's a stronghold, which is something I didn't realize, 20 years ago. I didn't realize that the ANC had that much influence in Durban until I started going to Durban on a regular basis, and it was nauseating seeing all the pro-ANC stuff. I'm not a fan. Anyway, even though I gave them a fair shake back then, I wasn't a fan. I mean, this is a political party that has done what most political parties do. The moment they take power, they try to stay in power forever. They redrew all the municipal boundaries in South Africa, reducing their municipalities from 1,200 down to 280 or something. Now it's 230 or something like that. They keep reducing it. And people are like, well, so what? I'm like, what do you mean, so what? So now you've taken small towns that had mayors and councils, and they were in rural locations or peri-urban locations where ethnic minorities could win the election. So Zulu could win with the IFP in parts of KwaZulu-Natal. You would see Afrikaners win in the Free State or in Mpumalanga or somewhere like that. You would see see Venda win this place. And then those people could be part of a political party, and they would get experience as members of government. But what the ANC did is they sucked up all these things into super municipalities, and all these councils disappeared, and those thousands of votes were now dwarfed by hundreds of thousands of votes, and the ANC wins. So the ANC deploys its cadre, and none of the opposition parties get any experience in ward councils or municipal or provincial government, and that harmed South Africa's democracy immeasurably. You need only look at Zimbabwe, where the Movement for Democratic Change had no idea what they were doing when they finally came into government. And they failed miserably, in part because they had no experience. They didn't know what they're doing. So a similar sort of situation in South Africa.
Do you think the ANC will accept a loss? If they were to lose an election, would they accept it?
I have always said the ANC would accept a loss. However, I'm moving towards the fence on this one now. I'm not saying that they won't, but I have grave concerns. I mean, they have no idea what they're doing. There's an internal civil war going in the ANC, which I've been telling people about for 4 years. And only now are people starting to listen to me after the looting in KZN. Oh, it was a group of 12 people. No, this is an internal civil war in the ANC. Well, we saw that Ace Magashule and Julius Malema and Beckett Sile all went to Nkandla. It was all part of a plot. No, it's all part of an anti-Ramaphosa coalition led by Zuma supporters who make up 40 to 50% of the party to begin with. I mean, Ramaphosa has always been on a knife's edge. From the time that he won the election in the party Congress over Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, he was 70 votes ahead. 36 people voting for her instead of for him, and she's the president. Because you don't get to vote for the president, Parliament votes, and they would have picked. They had the majority in Parliament. So it was that close. And you'll notice this from the moment he took office. Who does he appoint? All of these Zuma stalwarts, all the people complicit in state capture. Why? Because he doesn't have the strength to run the party. He could be unseated. And frankly, I mean, if the ANC was honest about what's going on, they'd probably unseat their own president right now because of his incompetence. But they're not. At this point, they're just a RICO operation.
So, during the looting, we saw really firsthand how useless our army was. I mean, the private security basically protected the country. I mean, it was literally taxi bosses that defended the Free State. I mean, the army was nowhere. And so, as someone who is quite of an army expert, we've spoken to someone, Bantu Holobisa, the leader of the UDM, who said that the army is in this state because of a lack of funding. Do you think that is the case, that the army in South Africa just doesn't receive the funds to be a proper army to protect us?
Well, there's a couple things to unpack here, and if I forget one of the points, make me come back to it. But
Sure.
I've also had Bantu Holomisa on my channel a couple of times on my program. In fact, he was on last Friday, and we don't agree on all positions, but we agree on a number of things. So first off, he's right. The Army, instead of spending money to buy frigates or corvettes, whatever you want to call them, it depends on who classifies them, and Type 209 diesel submarines and Gripen fighters that never get in the air and Hawk Legion fighter trainers, the money should have been spent, a small fraction of that money should have been spent on improving the barracks and the training facilities of the South African National Defense Force. They took all of the Bantustan armies, like General Holomisa's Transkei Defense Force and Botswana and the Ciskei, they brought them all together along with the Pan-African Congress's army and Mkhonto weSizwe, the Spear of the Nation, what a joke they are. They brought them all together. They've killed more of their own people than they killed people in the bush, trust me. Anyway, so they bring them together and they form a military that overnight goes from about 50,000 to 180,000. And then they had to process people. And over a couple of years, they got it back down to 70 and then 60. And they settled on a size around 60 or 70,000 for the South African Defense Forces. So what they should have done is they should have focused on training for the Army, because who has done all the things that, who's actually been utilized in post-apartheid South Africa? Not the Air Force, not the Navy. It's the Army. The Army's been sent on peacekeeping mission in the Congo, in Eritrea, in negotiations in Ivory Coast, in the Central African Republic, and now in Mozambique. It's not the Navy and Air Force going. It's the Army. So the money should have been spent there, and they needed new trucks. They're using the same trucks that they had under the apartheid government, many of these trucks. And their armored vehicles, they have the Centurion still. They're 1950s British tanks that were upgraded by Denel. It's just crazy. The money should have been spent in the Army for professionalization and also for equipment and training. And you could have spent a fraction of that and put the rest in education. So yes, the Army is underfunded. It's a disaster. But also what's neglected is such a high HIV prevalence rate in the Army. That's not talked about. Did you want to get in? I think you want to get in there for a second.
Well, I mean, do you think the reason why they want to spend money on like frigates and stuff like that instead of training is because it's much easier to steal money if it's if it's sent to a frigate than to training facilities?
Yes, it's much easier to steal money when you have a multi-$100 million contract with a French corporation or a German company that's abroad where eyes aren't focused on it, rather than buying trucks from someone like Denel or a truck manufacturer or Oshkosh in the States. And it's a much smaller contract. I mean, you could feel the whole Army with all the equipment they need for a tiny fraction of what they used to buy just the frigates. I mean, it was hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. So yeah, that's why. That was why. But it's also ego. Now we're in charge. We're in charge now. It's our army. Yeah, we're going to transform this army. Yeah. I mean, that's part of it. I mean, that's honestly part of it. But I got a little bit off track answering your question there about the army. So the army is underfunded. That's true. But there's something that's important here too. When people criticize the army for KZN and Haoteng response, people need to understand the role of the military. Now, different states have different roles, but by and large, the South African military's purpose is not to quell violence in South Africa. It's an external mission. So they have done yeoman's work despite a lack of funding, patrolling the borders, particularly with Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Swaziland, but particularly Mozambique. People don't know that on any given time before the pandemic, there are as many as 7 infantry companies actively pulling foot patrol along the borders with Zimbabwe to keep the border under control. That's a huge mission, plus all the peacekeeping abroad. So that's part of it too. But like, for instance, here in America, we have a reserve component. The National Guard is part of the reserve. They are actually under the control of the governors of each of the states. So like your provinces are states. So on a day-to-day basis here in Pennsylvania, the National Guard answers to the governor. If there's a flood, if there's a hurricane, if there's a tornado, he can activate them to respond. If there's civil unrest, he can activate the Guard, and they're actually trained to deal with civil unrest. They're given batons and shields, and they're taught formations and how to disperse crowds, how to use riot control gas and all that stuff. I was in the Guard. I went through this training. We used to go to a prison. We went to a state prison all the time, and we practiced on prisoners, which they didn't enjoy, but that's how we did it. Anyway, so the point is that the army shouldn't be out doing that. That's one of the reasons why South Africa fell in such ill repute in 1985 in Soweto, because the army was in the townships. When the police were out there, they were overwhelmed. They brought the army in, and the army was what was seen on cameras around the world. And people were like, what's an army doing? Suppressing its people. That shouldn't be the role of the army. That doesn't mean South Africa doesn't have legal authority to do it, but it should be a secondary concern. The army, the thing that's missing is the commando system. The ANC illegitimately disbanded the commando system well over a decade ago on the false claim that it was a racist organization. Of course, the problem with that argument is the 4 newest regiments in the commando system were all in KwaZulu-Natal, and they were black.
Just for our viewers, the commando system is it like the protection of the farmers?
No, that was part of its mission. So the commando, think about this in terms for American viewers and for those in South Africa, is the Minuteman. In our revolution and back when our country expanded, people were isolated in rural areas and on the frontier. And when there was a threat, someone would ride horseback and sound the alarm and ring the church bells, and people would grab their horse, their musket, their powder, and some supplies like hardtack or biltong, throw it in their saddlebags, and they'd all assemble in a unit. And a local unit, a commando. And that's what they did. So the Minuteman system was similar to that we had here in the States. The commando system was like that. That's the origins of it. Now, the ANC claimed it was apartheid era creation, but the problem is the commando system dates back to the 18th century, the late 1700s is when there were already commandos formed as there were incursions between the Xhosa and the Trek Boers and the Boers who were moving eastward to the Great Fish River. These things already started forming, and people had self-defense units basically called commandos.
It's probably because they are fearful that a commando system would inspire people to take action, to take matters into their own hands, right? I mean, if the ANC continues to be useless, a commando system would be able to fulfill their obligations, and that would be a terrible indictment on them.
Well, but the commando system isn't a private organization. It's state. It's owned just like the police and military by the state. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm not talking like the board commando or something. I'm talking about the actual, there were 178 commando units that are basically reservists, and they're ordered active duty. What they did, even under the ANC government for a number of years, is they would be ordered up on weekends or during the week, and they did coordinated search operations. They did mandrake seizures, daga seizures. They confiscated tons of illicit narcotics in South Africa. They also were reinforcement for rural insecurity and responded to farm attacks and things like that. They also reinforced the police and police reservists to check for stolen vehicles and things like that by doing roadblocks. They did quite a bit. And for the 4 regiments that were in KwaZulu-Natal that were all black, that was the only form of formal employment that most of those people had. And it was only part-time. So when they disbanded it, claiming it was a racist system, they were disingenuous, and they weakened the security in rural South Africa. Now, that's not the only reason it's weak. I mean, let's be honest, no matter where you are in the world, if you're on a farm, you're isolated. You could be in Montana, you're going to be isolated in a farm. If somebody means you ill will, that's why people are armed in Montana.
But another problem probably for our military is also cadre deployment, that sergeants or corporals all of a sudden become colonels and generals just because they're corrupt. And that has become also probably a problem in our military.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. I mean, when I hear the term cadre, because I don't listen like cadres, they say cadre. Cadre deployment to me is when the ANC sends its apparatchiks out into governments or into the Western Province or into the Eastern Cape or something like that. They send them down. That's a cadre deployment to me, is their apparatchiks. What you're talking about, we did see a situation after the end of apartheid in '94 when the SADF, the South African Defence Force, became the South African National Defence Force, the SANDF, the SADF to SANDF. We saw a lot of people come in and then be advanced in rank. People who weren't even officers were a lieutenant, and then months later a captain, then lieutenant colonel. Some of that was necessary. I mean, just for stability. I mean, you're going to have a very difficult time leading a force of 180,000. You have to whittle down to 50 or 60,000 when all the people make decisions are white guys, and you just fought this war, or they thought they fought a war over, racial inequity, and everyone making decisions about you're getting kicked out because a white guy. Yeah, so some of that was necessary. We did see a number of elevations of people in uniform that were premature. I don't really have a dog in the fight arguing for or against that. There were also very successful ones. Admiral Mudemu, who was in charge of the Navy, had no naval experience, became the chief of the Navy, was actually brilliant at it. I mean, one of the really good leaders in post-apartheid South Africa. But then you also have situations like you had General Kagame, who was in charge of the South African Air Force forever. He wanted to retire, and they wouldn't let him retire. He 3 times asked to retire, and they said no, because they had no one to replace him, because they had people to replace him, but they were white. They wanted a black general to replace him, and the black generals lacked the experience. It took time. So actually, I would say that the ANC government, from a political standpoint, used a fair amount of restraint when it came to elevating people in uniform prematurely. Today's a whole different story. Those days are gone. I really can't speak to how people are being promoted in the SANDF today, because I'm not covering it that closely. But the days of that sort of, you're a sergeant one day, then you're a lieutenant colonel next day, that's gone to my knowledge. I would be shocked if that existed today. What exists today is a quota system, and people are promoted based on politics, especially to the rank of lieutenant colonel and higher, and not necessarily in qualifications. And that holds true whether they're white, colored, Indian, or black.
Yeah, no, yeah, I might be confusing cadre deployment with just corruption in general. But what was interesting to me in the video where you explained to American audience about South Africa, you also mentioned you have quite extensive knowledge about Southern Africa and Africa in general. How does a country like Botswana compare with South Africa? Because I don't think a lot of people know a lot about Botswana, even South Africans. I mean, if you just take their GDP per capita, Botswana is a richer country than South Africa. I think that's an amazing achievement. Can you tell us a bit about that country?
Sure, I can tell you a lot about Botswana. I'm a huge fan of it, but I'm honest about my assessment. So let me throw the warts out there first and tell you a few things. Botswana has had one ruling party since it became a country in 1966. It was never a colony. What? No, it was never a colony. The Dikosi, the main chiefs of the Tswana-speaking peoples in Botswana, which was 85% of the population at the time, and still is, they approached the British and said, listen, I'm going to paraphrase here, okay? So just roll with me here. Listen, these Boers keep coming across our border with their cattle and taking some of our cattle and taking our best lands, and we're a little concerned about losing our land. Can you help us out here? And the Brits are like, yeah, we'll make it a protectorate, and then we'll stop them from incurring across your border. So it became Bechuanaland in the 19th century and a British protectorate. But it was so unimportant to the Brits that the capital for Bechuanaland wasn't in Bechuanaland or Botswana. It was in Mafeking in South Africa. That's where the capital of the minister was, because they cared so little about it. All they wanted was a buffer there so that the Trek Boers wouldn't keep, expanding and going in that direction. And that's what they got. So there were some Trek Boers that tried to go through Botswana, and a very famous thing called the Doorsland Trekker, the Thirst Trek. The Doorsland Trek, and there were 2 of those, and they were very horrific. People went through the Kalahari without any knowledge of the Kalahari, and many of them died. In fact, one group got to eastern Namibia, and they had to spend a whole year recuperating. They were in such grave condition, and they were helped by the Basarwa, or the Bushman people there. Anyway, so Botswana. It's been ruled by one political party, and that has been a weakness in the last decade, especially. It's been challenged on 2 occasions, which they nearly lost power, but because the sitting party can pick 4 members of parliament, they've managed to keep their majority those times. It's got a reputation for being corruption free, but that's not true. It is largely corruption free, but there is also corruption in Botswana, and also some at the highest levels. The other problem with it right now is that people talking about being a wealthy country, but 40% of the population lives on less than $2.50 a day. So wealth disparity is very high, just like South Africa, just like China, just like the US, just like Brazil. Wealth disparity is very high. But the difference in the US is that there's a big pie for everybody. There isn't a big pie for everybody in South Africa or in China or in Botswana. So those are the warts. And the last word I'd like to tell you about is the current president really needs to step down. Eric Masisi is a complete okay, he's not up to the task. He started this tiff with his predecessor who appointed him, and it's really grown out of control. And he has been implicated in corruption now, and he's been implicated in all kinds of dodgy decisions. So those are the worst. But how does Botswana do it? Well, great leadership. Great leadership. Now, the first president of independent Botswana was Seretse Khama, a raging alcoholic and a wife beater, apparently. I don't know if he actually beat his wife. He married Ruth, a white woman, and the South African government during apartheid kept him from coming home because they were able to use their influence. And so he couldn't come back to Botswana after he married a white woman because you can't have that mixing. And they still had the anti-miscegenation laws in South Africa. So he eventually was able to get back in the country and part of a political party just before independence. His party won, the Botswana Democratic Party, and he ruled with very good leadership. The other thing Botswana did is in the early days, the capital, Gaborone, had about 5,000 people. Today it's about 400,000. And they had 16 miles or 16 kilometers of paved roads, coal tar road. The rest was dirt. There are no roads. But what happened was that realizing that they didn't have many people qualified to lead ministries, to make decisions, to do things, instead of kicking people out, because there's a significant white population in Botswana, it's about 7 to 9%. It's on par with South Africa. It's just the numbers are tiny because it's a small country. But it's always been about 7 to 10% of the population of Botswana has been white or European, and not just South Africans, but also Americans, Brits who went there. And so they employed people as contractors, as members of the government, in the government, to build a professional bureaucracy, to build capacity. And that paid off. And even to this day, you find lots of whites who live in Botswana. The three main places are in Gaborone, the capital, where they work in business and in the government. Also in Francistown, which is a major mining center in the northeast. And then in Maun, which is a huge tourism center for the Okavango Delta. You'll find lots of white pilots out there, tourism operators. And here's the thing. Probably because apartheid was never in Botswana, people in Botswana don't have these screwed up attitudes about race. And so you will see a white woman with a black man and people won't bat an eye. But if I drive over to Pretoria, people stare at you, black and white.
And that probably also affects your politics because there's no excuse to say, okay, but there was apartheid or whatever. You have to do your job. There's no excuse there.
Exactly right. Race. And I mean, don't get me wrong. There's always idiots that have racism in their heart, but it's a very small number, and it's even smaller in Botswana. People don't care if you're white or black or mixed race. I mean, there are coloreds in Botswana, not a lot, mostly in the southern part of the country because they come across the border from the Northern Cape and they have families, and so they've been there, since time immemorial. Either whether they're part of the Greek was or they're Orlums or whoever. But anyway, so you've got an interesting situation in which race doesn't play any role in Botswana, and you have an honest government and you have a police force that's honest. I've never been asked for a bribe by a police officer in Botswana. I can't say the same thing in South Africa. even with diplomatic license plates, I've been shaken down for a bribe in South Africa by cops. Wow. That's pretty cheeky. No, but that doesn't mean it's a land of milk and honey. There are challenges, high HIV rate, also creeping corruption is there, and a president that really needs to go elsewhere. But Botswana is by and large a successful country because of fantastic strategic leadership. I don't like 5-year plans. It sounds very Soviet-esque, but they have these 5-year plans and they've had a succession of them. The one key failure of the government that they haven't addressed is they have not diversified the economy. Botswana's economy is still heavily reliant on minerals and diamonds in particular. Without that, they wouldn't be as wealthy as they are. But they've put the money to good use. And they also have land program. If you're a Botswana, which is BAT, not Botswana, but Botswana. If you're a Botswana, you qualify for land just by birth. Now, eventually that's not going to work. All the land will be gone. But everybody up through the generations to 66, you apply to the government for your plot of land. And they're still doing that.
That's fascinating. And if we go upward in Africa, I've been to Rwanda. And Rwanda is also a very interesting story because if you compare it to what that situation was in 1994, I mean, civil war, genocide, it really feels like Rwanda had a sort of like a phoenix from the ashes it rose. What do you think about a country like Rwanda?
Well, there's no denying that Rwanda is a huge success story when it comes to the way it prosecuted war crimes and crimes against humanity. The way that it is, as you mentioned, as an apropos description, a phoenix rising from the ashes. Uh, and it's a great place to do business. It's like Botswana. You can register business in just a couple of days and be in business. The government is honest. The cities are clean, which is rare in Africa.
Yeah.
There's no litter, there's no rubbish lying around, and people think that's a small thing, but it's not. It has a big impact on commerce and other things. And then the telecommunications are awesome. They're really without peer in the region. The economy is growing. Volkswagen just built a production facility there to make Volkswagens for export throughout East Africa, and it's very popular. But it's also very authoritarian. Paul Kagame has been president since they chased the genocideers out in 1994. It's time to go, Paul. Let me ask you this question: who's another politician in Rwandan politics? Can you name one? I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No, I can't. Well,
You can't.
I
Well,
think I can also pronounce it. So
Yeah,
so
well,
that's
yeah,
nice.
but I was going to say I almost can't either, and I'm an Africanist. The point is that one big man is controlling everything. And it's a very authoritarian situation. A lot of people accuse Rwanda of abuse of press freedoms, of individual liberties, of unlawful detention. There's a lot of that stuff that's out there, and some of it's true. And this is because the country is accustomed. Now, to be fair, after genocide, you probably needed an authoritarian to get things under control. But at some point, the big man has to step down. This is the problem with Yoweri Museveni in neighboring Uganda, and also the problem with Paul Kagame. They don't know when to leave the stage. And they're not training their subordinates to take over. So when they leave the stage, there's going to be carnage or a power vacuum, and it's all going to fall apart. And that means it's not sustainable. Whereas in Botswana, that government is sustainable.
And what I don't really understand is when I spoke to the Rwandan people, Paul Kagame is widely popular. Like people like him a lot, at least to the people I spoke to. So why does he really do this? I mean, it feels like he would win every election overwhelmingly. He's sort of like their liberation figure. So why does he go into that effort to make the opposition people disappear?
Well, I didn't say he made anybody disappear, but but I get what you disappear. They go abroad, which a lot of people do. It stems from acculturation, what you grow up in. Paul Kagame matured as a young man in an environment of conflict and in obedience and loyalty to the guerrilla force he was working with. And a lot of people don't know this, but I mean, he was involved in the Ugandan war. So one of the first raid that Yoweri Museveni's movement had was on an army base in the southwest of the country, which is the region he's from. And that base was attacked by, I forget the exact number. It's like 40 rebels. They attacked it. Only like a handful, 4 or 5 of them had any weapons at all. And they just raided this base, which is now an engineering headquarters out there. And there's a big statue there, and it's Museveni on there. If you look at the plaque underneath, it mentions the 19 people who survived or something. I forget the number. Anyway, Paul Kagame's like number 2 on there. He was the right-hand man of Yoweri Museveni, which is ironic because now they hate each other over the last 5 or 6 years. But it's this inculcation of authoritarianism, and people have a hard time letting go of it. I mean, this is why the ANC is the way it is. I mean, it's not because they're all evil. I mean, some of them are. The reason the ANC is the way it is because they're accustomed to this culture of loyalty above all. I mean, listen, it's very telling that when South African presidents list their qualifications, they say President of the African National Congress, President of South Africa. Wait a second. Why aren't you President of South Africa and then President of the ANC? That comes first. You never see an American president going, I am the head of the Republican, I'm the head of the Democrat Party. No, you're the President of the United States. And that's kind of a screwed up thing. Loyalty to party over people. That's a problem in South Africa. Loyalty to the leader in Rwanda is overwhelming. A lot of people like him because they've grown up with a fair amount of prosperity and they're accustomed to having their freedoms limited. But when limiting freedoms is an act of a weak state, and it comes back to haunt you at some point.
You're basically, like you said, you're not training the next generation to take over. There's no real generation there to take over. But Rwanda is also the capital of many, or the host of many African Union meetings. And a lot of African leaders have been calling for a United States of Africa, if you can use that term. What do you think? Do you think that's really going to happen? And what do you think is the ramifications of that going to be for the rest of Africa? Because I think we're going to have sort of Brexit scenarios if there were to be an African, like a United States Africa.
Well, let me preface this by starting off going, okay, let's run through the list of African countries that actually exercise governance over their territory successfully and have done well for their citizens. Cape Verde, Mauritius, Botswana, maybe Malawi. I'm stretching. I'm running out of things at this point. So, what's to make someone believe that a government based in Addis Ababa at 9,900 feet where the air is thin and they can't think clearly? I'm being facetious. I used to live there. Uh, is going to be able to exercise authority over an entire continent the size of Africa. It takes 12 hours to fly from Frankfurt to Johannesburg. It takes 17 and a half hours to fly from Johannesburg to Atlanta. Who thinks that someone can exercise sovereignty over a landmass that great with Mediterranean, desert, jungle, subtropical environments, mountains, prairies, plains, tons of unnavigable rivers, no electricity from, 635 million Africans have no electricity. How can you govern over something like that? That is the biggest joke ever. And this isn't the first time. Muammar Gaddafi, the only reason the African Union exists is because of Muammar Gaddafi. He wanted to be the president of the United States of Africa. He's the one that coined the phrase USA because he thought he'd try to replicate America. So what he did is that the Organization of African Unity, you couldn't vote if you were in arrears on your dues. And like 20 plus states in Africa, almost 20, didn't pay their dues. They didn't have the money. So every time there was a vote, only a minority of states could vote and then would pass. So in order to change it from the OAU, which had a couple overriding missions, number one is end colonialism, number two is all borders are sacrosanct. So that was its main reason it existed. Well, colonialism ended, states were free. So Gaddafi said, hey, there's no need for the OAU. Let's change it into something like the European Union, the African Union. And the only reason that they had a vote at the CERT conference and the CERT 2 conference, the only reason they were able to do it and start it based on a conference in Cape Town was because Muammar Gaddafi paid the arrears for every African state because he had tons of money. So suddenly everybody, their dues were paid, they could all vote, and they all felt beholden to Muammar Gaddafi. So they all voted to create the African Union. They created the African Union, and people think the African Union is the EU. It's not. It's not a governing body. It has no sovereignty whatsoever ever over any African state. It's a gentleman's club in which you have to reach consensus on agreements. Now, the bureaucracy can take certain decisions and implement certain things, but 80%, 85% of their funding comes from us, the European Union and the United States and China. So the African, because they can't fund themselves. They have no mechanism to fund themselves. They've tried a couple proposals. How about a tourism tax? Well, countries like South Africa and Kenya and Namibia are like, whoa, wait a second. We make a lot of money from tourism. You want to punish us when no one else is going to contribute? And then like, okay, let's have a tax on hotels. Well, that's not fair. You're going to suppress our hotel industry all over Africa. So they've got no mechanism to raise revenue. So they exist at the largesse of the Europeans and the Americans who feel guilty over colonialism. That's where they get their budget from.
But
not going to happen. Not going to happen.
But but haven't they released a plan to create borderless countries and a African passport? It seems like they're quite serious on that one.
Well, not borderless countries, but there is
free migration.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, something like the Schengen Agreement in the European Union, which people can just cross the borders without being stopped by authorities. That's with an African passport. That's a plan. Some of the regional economic communities already have these things. ECOWAS has had an ECOWAS passport for years. And any one of the 16 states in ECOWAS or 15 states, you can go any one of them without a national passport with the ECOWAS passport. But no one else recognizes it. You can't go to Europe or Australia on an ECOWAS passport. They'll laugh at you and put you on a plane and send you back. You have to have your national passport. The African passport thing, the problem with that is it's going to create all sorts of problems. We already have a situation last year in which Donald Trump suspended anyone who wanted to immigrate to America from Nigeria because after 16 years, Nigeria still failed to follow the international standards for passports post 9/11 with biometrics and by reporting criminal data on applicants. So we were getting people immigrating from Nigeria to America who were being issued passports by Nigerian authorities with false names, with false backgrounds to cover up criminal activity. And the Nigerian government couldn't verify the provenance of that person, where they came from, who they were. And they're like, okay, they can immigrate to your country. So last year, Trump said, nope, we're done with this. We're not doing it anymore. And after almost 17 years of tolerating Nigeria and about a dozen other countries doing it, he said, that's it. And of course, he was called a racist immediately. But when they called him a racist, they failed to notice that the same day that he put a restriction on Nigeria, they lifted it on Chad. Last time I checked, it was an all-black Muslim country. So if he's a racist, why is he letting the Chadians immigrate to America, but not the Nigerians? So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, and that makes complete sense. But yeah, Colonel, this has been a very fascinating conversation. I see our time is a bit running up. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
Yeah, sure. If you're a South African and you don't vote, then this is your fault. This is your fault. And if you don't vote in municipal elections, or you don't do something now to push your government and your politicians to ensure that there's a vote, or deluge the Constitutional Court to make sure they do something. And when I say deluge, I don't mean, you show up there on their doorsteps, but ring their phones, send their emails, crash their servers, whatever it takes to get their attention. Go in the press, scream, go on television, go on YouTube, whatever it takes. You have got to do something. Your democracy is at stake. This is not hyperbole. This is not exaggeration. I'm serious. If the ANC successfully delays elections, there's a real chance that enough people will forget the idiotic bans on the sale of cooked chicken and open-toed shoes and no alcohol and no cigarettes. And if you leave your house, you're going to be in prison. And the ban on e-commerce, because, well, that's really helpful for a pandemic. Let's ban the one thing that keeps people out of stores, e-commerce. So people will forget about that. And they'll forget about those who didn't lose a job because they still got a job. They'll forget about the 3 million South Africans who lost their livelihoods and suffered immeasurably. They'll also forget about the failure of South Africa's government to get involved in the vaccine development and then try to play the race card after a vaccine was developed. And then still, it takes them 8 months before they start putting jabs in people. And they'll also forget that in the state of a disaster, the South African government closes its medical clinics on the weekends. If you have a state of disaster, you should be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, giving people the jab if the jab is the way out of it. But that's not what's going on. They're suppressing your freedoms, and you people are sitting at home just bitching about it and complaining about it and doing nothing to take a positive step. And I don't want to hear, oh, the DA, screw that. I don't want to hear it. Oh, the EFF. Vote for somebody. The Freedom Front, the IDP, not the IDP, the UDP, the Inkatha Freedom Party. Vote for somebody that's not ANC, because this party has proven it's not capable of governing South Africa. You need to get out and vote if there's an election, and you need to make sure there's an election. If you don't, you have no one to blame but yourself, because it's all in your lap, South Africans. 17 million people didn't vote in the national elections in 2019. That's 17 million people plus another 2 or 3 or 4 million that would not normally vote in this election. Get out there. It only takes a small number of votes for your party or to win an election in a municipality. And if you win the election in 2021, if it happens, or February 2022, you prove by 2023 that other parties can actually govern and deliver services with legitimate, honest governance, and then the ANC is dead in the water forever.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a very powerful message, and I couldn't agree more. But thank you, Colonel. Thank you so much for your time. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. My name is Donald. This has been WorldView.